Anti-Iranian government protests are spreading across the world following the death of a 22-year-old woman in police custody earlier this month. Activists say Iranian forces have killed at least 76 protesters during several days of unrest. In the nation, hundreds have been arrested. Mahsa Amini died after being arrested by the country's morality police for not covering her hair properly with a hijab. So joining me now for more on this is CBS News senior foreign correspondent Holly Williams. I wanted to emphasize that because she was wearing a hijab. She just wasn't wearing it properly, according to the morality police. Holly, there are protests now sprouting up all over the place. How widespread have these protests become in Iran alone?
It's such an important question because this is not just centred on the Iranian capital, Tehran, or other major cities. We've now seen protests in 80 towns and cities across the country. So it's extremely widespread. We've had protests now for 11 days. Activists say that 76 people have been killed, at least 76 people. Even the regime acknowledges that 41 people have been killed. And by some reports, over 1,000 people have been arrested, including the prominent daughter of one former president. Now, look, I mean, Iran has experienced mass protests before, and famously there have been sort of previous instances where protesters have been shot and killed by the regime. But what is so unusual about what we're seeing here is that the protests were not only sparked by the death of a woman, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who, as you said, was arrested by the police for improperly covering her head, as is required under Iranian law. But the protests themselves are centred on the mandatory enforcement of the hijab, or the Islamic head covering, which is contentious in Iran and which is obviously a women's issue. And the protests themselves are in many cases led by women. So, you know, in other words, this is a women's movement that is being supported by men. And you can hear that in at least one of the chants that's being yelled out at these protests. They're saying women, life, freedom. So, you know, there you have it. They're linking this specific way in which some women are oppressed in Iran with broader repressions in Iranian society.
So let me ask you, Holly, in the UK, what the response has been to the death of Mahsa Amini and the ensuing unrest in Iran. We've not just seen it in Iran, as you know. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in France. These protests are happening in Canada at the Iranian embassies all over the world.
Right. There's a big Iranian diaspora, and we've seen people come out in support of the protesters around the world. On Sunday here in London, there was an angry protest outside the Iranian embassy. Those protesters supporting the protesters back in Iran and calling for an end to the Islamic Republic. Unfortunately, that protest turned violent, and there were clashes between the protesters and the police who were protecting that embassy compound. And in the end, 12 people were arrested.
And then we also hear about players on Iran's national soccer team covering their country's emblem during the national anthem prior to Tuesday's World Cup tune-up match. How significant is that?
Well, it's very interesting. This actually happened on Tuesday. So it was a World Cup warm-up between the Iranian national team and Senegal. They were actually playing in Austria. And so during the playing of Iran's national anthem, when you would normally expect the Iranian national team to be wearing their team uniform, their national strip, they instead wore plain black jackets over the top. And that was widely interpreted as a wordless protest and, you know, a courageous show of support for the protesters back home. And in fact, one of the protesters reportedly posted on Instagram before the game in support of the protesters, in support of women in Iran, but later deleted that post.
So could these protests, Holly, in Iran mark a turning point for the nation's regime, or is it just a matter of time before it returns to the status quo? You know, this is not the first time that there have been protests against the theocracy in Iran, as you know. And it feels every time that there is one, in the early days of the Arab Spring, for example, that there are many people, many Iranians who are living in the United States or elsewhere. There's a sort of a buoyancy around the notion that this could lead to the downfall of the regime. But we've never really seen that.
Yeah, it's such a complicated and difficult question. As you said, I mean, Iran has seen mass protests many times before. Clearly, a large section of the Iranian public has been chafing under this sort of conservative form of Islamic rule since the founding of the Islamic Republic back in 1979. They don't like the kind of social and political restrictions that they live under. This is yet another explosion of anger and frustration on the street. Clearly, it's destabilizing for the regime and potentially a threat to the regime. But on the other hand, this is still a very powerful regime, and it's important to point out that it still enjoys support from more conservative sections of the population. What I do think these protests show is just how desperate some Iranians are for change, and they're willing to risk their lives and their freedom to push the regime as hard as they can.
All right, Holly Williams for us. Thank you very much, Holly. Appreciate it.
Thank you.